Today we're looking at Fisherman's Song, which is the next poem in Kayo Chingonyi's collection Kumukanda. Now this is a deceptively simple but emotionally complex poem. It packs a whole lot into just two short stanzas. Despite being short, it uses imagery and really powerful language techniques to explore quite dark ideas in things like trauma, isolation, parental responsibility, and, the grim realities that are hidden beneath everyday life. As always, we're going to take a look at the poem and the meaning behind the poem. As I said in my previous video, this isn't an attempt to identify every single poetic technique. I want this to be a starting point for you to develop your interpretation and understanding of this poem. So we're going to talk about some of the ideas. I'm going to offer some of my interpretations, but that doesn't mean necessarily that you have to adopt them. You might disagree with me, and if you do, then please post a comment in the comments below and let me know how you saw this poem differently. Fisherman's Song. I want us to think about what makes this a song, and I actually want to do that at the very end of the video, okay? So let's actually talk about what the poem contains, and then later on we'll think about the rhythm and the musical qualities, or what music means to this poem. Because I think it's a really important feature, and it's a really exciting opportunity to think about the form and structure of the poem, which is something that's quite easy to ignore. Let's hear the poet himself performing just the first stanza of this poem, Fisherman's Song, and then let's dive into the meaning behind it.
What sadness for a fisherman who navigates the blue to find among receding nets strange underwater blooms that look at first like bladderwrack, but from a closer view are clumps of matted human hair atop an acrid soup.
Look how this poem begins. It doesn't beat around the bush. We get straight into the topic of the poem. What sadness for a fisherman to navigate the blue. So we're immediately told, we're introduced to this fisherman. He's never given a name, but we're told that this is a fisherman who experiences sadness and who navigates the blue. Okay, so notice straight away that there is a double meaning here. Literally, the fisherman navigates the blue. He, in a boat, goes and explores the sea in order to catch fish. But notice that blue is often associated with sadness and depression. And you can see this across, art and music and culture. You think about Picasso's Blue period, or Joni Mitchell's album Blue, or, just the idea of being a bit blue, as Disney's Inside Out demonstrates. And you think about, the blues, feeling a bit blue. This idea is very pervasive. The stanza begins with this image of a fisherman who is navigating the blue in two senses of the word. But as the stanza develops, something happens. And find among receding nets strange underwater blooms. We get this image here of the fisherman bringing in the nets and finding something there, these strange underwater blooms. Okay, and now what Chingonyi does here in this stanza, it's a series of images, and he makes extensive use of imagery as a technique. We'll talk more about imagery in just a second. But what's important here is that we are sensitive to what these images connotate. What connotations do these images have? So strange underwater blooms. Whilst the word strange is there, so we know there's something unusual going on, underwater blooms is actually quite a beautiful image. You think of a sort of natural floral image. I associate blooms with flowers being in bloom, with springtime, with life, with happiness. At first, we believe that this fisherman has found something that's unusual but perhaps quite attractive, associating it with some interesting bit of nature. However, things are not what they appear to be. And imagery is key to this first stanza. So, what is imagery? These are elements of a poem that invoke any of the five senses to create a set of mental images. So specifically using vivid or figurative language to represent ideas, objects, or actions. So thinking about the use of sensory information to create a set of mental images. Now we have that first one, the strange underwater blooms. And think to yourself, can you imagine what that looks like in a fishing net that's just been dragged onto the boat? Seeing these sort of strange colours and strange shapes. Okay, what could it be? Let's get back to the poem to understand what it is. Strange underwater blooms that look at first like bladderwrack. What we get here is actually these strange underwater blooms. They look like something. And notice there that use of at first between commas. Now that is something that we could call caesura in poetry. It forces a pause in the middle of a line. So not at the end of a line, in the middle. Now what does that do in this situation? I would suggest it actually creates a little bit of tension, a little bit of nervousness. What is bladderwrack? I'm sure you're thinking that, unless you are perhaps from a coastal town. I didn't know what bladderwrack was. It's this, okay? It's a real type of seaweed. Even if you didn't know what bladderwrack was, just listen to the word itself. It doesn't sound particularly appealing. Bladderwrack. The word bladderwrack itself actually sounds quite repulsive. I think it possibly has something to do with the word bladder being in there. And then you get that really hard k sound at the end. Bladderwrack. It could be the name of a monster, and that's quite appropriate for this poem. Even without knowing what the word meant, you could tell that this word is somehow unappealing, and it definitely contrasts with that previous line. The word blooms is quite beautiful, it's quite soft, it's gentle. And then we get this contrast of the sound like bladderwrack. And as I said, the caesura there, building tension. Why is tension building? But from a closer view are clumps of matted human hair atop an acrid soup. So the poet's using imagery and creating the contrast between what the fisherman thinks he has originally caught and what he's actually caught. And again, thinking about imagery as using sensory information, look how powerful this is. Clumps of matted human hair. So this idea of being matted, it appeals to our sense of touch, the texture of it. It's sort of grotesque and horrible. Matted human hair. It's really tactile, and that makes it really off-putting. And then that's followed by this idea of being atop an acrid soup. But notice here how you have the alliteration of human hair and atop an acrid soup. So this alliteration on both lines creates this sort of claustrophobia almost. It's like we're tangled up in this horrible thing that's been caught and we can't really escape it. And it creates this moment of horror as we realize, along with the fisherman, what's actually been caught in this net is disgusting. And also the use of the word soup as a sort of metaphor, it turns our stomach. Why would we compare this human hair to some sort of soup, something that you would eat? So this is a very intentional structuring and use of imagery by Kaiu Chingonyi to build up to a climax that is really revolting and disgusting and disturbing. The fisherman is disturbed and the language makes it a disturbing experience. Back to that word acrid. What a fantastic word this is. Sharp and harsh or unpleasantly pungent in taste or odour. This appeals to our sense of smell, okay? So this idea of being atop an acrid soup, it just evokes decay, death, unpleasantness, a horrible, bitter, pungent smell. It's wonderfully structured to lead us up, just like the fisherman himself, to realizing, oh my gosh, what is it that I've caught here? It's certainly not a beautiful underwater bloom like I originally thought, and it's not even bladderwrack. And that brings me to an important question for Fisherman's Song, and this is a big challenge. What do you think the fisherman has actually caught here? We're only told that they found, or the fisherman's found, clumps of matted human hair. And that is ambiguous. And when I say ambiguous, I mean that meanings are deliberately left unclear. And it's up to us as readers to develop our own interpretations. And that's actually a fantastic thing. So, what has the fisherman found here? I think there are a number of different valid interpretations. The first one could be it's a poem that references pollution. Because after all, this fisherman is out there to catch fish. He's engaged with nature. what he's actually found is matted human hair. So it could be a comment on the way that human activity is polluting the seas and the oceans, and this horror that the fisherman feels of finding human hair floating in the sea. I've seen this suggested elsewhere, but I do feel that this doesn't quite explain this sense of horror that Chingonyi creates in this first stanza. So it could be about pollution. That's not the interpretation that I found particularly compelling. Another way of thinking about it is that the fisherman himself is almost hallucinating. We're already told that he's navigating the blue, and perhaps his depression and sadness is so extreme that he can't even do his job without having these strange visions. He can't even pull in his catch of the day without thinking that it resembles human hair. So perhaps it is that the fisherman is suffering from some sort of mental health condition where he's seeing things or his whole experience of work has been completely destroyed. Again, I feel like I'm having to do a bit of work here to make it make sense. So that also doesn't really sit well with me. In fact, the first thing that I thought of when I read this poem was something much darker, but in many ways very topical, and I think linked to some of the wider themes that Chingonyi explores in Kumukanda. So we're told that the fisherman discovers human hair, but perhaps he's actually found a lot more than that. Perhaps we're only told about the clumps of human hair, but maybe the human hair belongs to a human body or a corpse in the water. And now this very dark and macabre interpretation of the poem could link chillingly to real-world events and news stories of the migrant crisis in Europe, where people risk their lives and often die in attempts to cross the sea. We could see this poem as very delicately touching on this tragic issue. And in fact, when I did a little bit of research, and these are obviously news stories that I find extremely troubling, it didn't take me long to discover that these stories exist in the world. There is this story here of fishermen who find human bodies in their nets when they work in the seas. On the one hand, I'm very aware that I'm bringing an interpretation to the poem, but on the other hand, I do believe that Fisherman's Song, the way that this first stanza is written, really allows us to think that maybe Chingonyi is referring to something much bigger here, whether that is mental health or pollution or the ongoing migrant crisis. This is my interpretation based on an ambiguity in the poem. You might disagree, and that is totally fine. I would love to hear what you think is going on in this poem. If the fisherman has just found clumps of human hair, what do you think that means? Why did Chingonyi choose to write about this moment in his poem? Whatever you think, whatever you consider is taking place here, it's important that you develop your interpretation of what is happening with these clumps of human hair that are floating in the sea, because I think that interpretation will be important for you to develop your response to the second stanza of the poem. Let's have a listen to that stanza now.
And what song shall this fisherman who loves a jaunty tune sing to lullaby his children, when dark shapes in their room make the night a snarling monster only Father's voice can soothe? And who will soothe the fisherman who navigates the blue?
So in stanza 2, the focus shifts from the external horror of the sea and work to the internal struggles that the fisherman faces. It begins by telling us that this fisherman loves a jaunty tune. Now here, Chingonyi is really using irony, isn't he? Because we know what this fisherman has seen. This fisherman has seen something quite disturbing in his day-to-day life. This suggestion of a jaunty tune and of lullabies, it creates a juxtaposition. The juxtaposition between the somewhat dark themes of the first stanza and this sort of sense of innocence that pervades the beginning of the second stanza. And this tension is really important for the poem. We get the impression that the fisherman here almost lives a double life, where he has to mask his inner fears and inner sadness or troubles with an external idea of being someone who loves a jaunty tune and can sing lullabies to his children. Why does the fisherman have to sing a lullaby to his children? His children see dark shapes in their room. And then we get this powerful metaphor that make the night a snarling monster. From the fears we have in the first stanza, we get more sort of dark imagery in the second. But notice here, this suggestion of the dark and of a snarling monster, these are fears that are presented in a somewhat childish or infantile way. The dark and monsters are the typical make-believe fears that children have, not the sort of fears that we think the fishermen may have. This contrast is really important between the sort of harsh realities in the first stanza and this childish innocence in the second stanza. Because what it does is it creates a tension, and that tension is focused around the issue of parental responsibility. To be more specific, the responsibility of being a father and what it means to be a father. Look at this next line. So, the dark shapes have made the night a snarling monster. Only father's voice can soothe. But I think this represents a real issue here, and it's an issue that's at the heart of Fisherman's Song as a poem. It is the responsibility of the fisherman here to protect his children. Look at the use of the word only and how this creates a sense of expectation. It's only the fisherman who can do this. And also notice how he is referred to here as father. It's not that he's a parent, it's to do with him being a father. And this is introducing an idea of gendered social expectation. The main character or the main topic of this poem is only referred to as two things. Firstly, as fisherman, and secondly, as father. Now, they're two gendered terms, and they both refer to his responsibilities and duties. And in many ways in this poem, he is struggling to perform both of them. As we know, we have a social expectation of fatherhood, the idea of being a provider and being a protector of the family. And I think Chingonyi, with this poem, is starting a conversation around essentially mental health in men. Now, we know this is a crisis that's ongoing, and that many men find it difficult to communicate and accept their struggles with mental health, as it seems to be incompatible with the ideals of what being a man or being a father is. You should be strong, you should be resilient, you shouldn't be scared or feel worried or allow yourself to be vulnerable. And we know that this mindset is actually extremely dangerous and can lead to quite tragic conclusions in men. It's always a bit of a question of how far can you go to analyze a poem, but I think this line really stood out to me, that only father's voice can soothe the sort of nightmares and the fears that his children have. And this focus on the voice, notice here that this is the fisherman's song, and we're told of how important his voice is. But at no point in the poem is he actually speaking or singing, for that matter. When it comes to the lullaby and the jaunty tune, in this stanza, we're told that he's thinking, what song should I sing? This is a poem of indecision and inaction, because it seems that the fisherman is occupied by much deeper and more troubling thoughts. So his inability to use his voice and find a suitable song to sing to alleviate his fears and those of his children suggests a total crisis of confidence for the fisherman. And then this issue is brought directly into sharp focus with the final lines of the poem. And here Chingonyi uses repetition quite cleverly. So the word soothe appears again. Now notice throughout the poem we get this consistent rhyme scheme. I'll talk about that in a moment. Tune, room, soothe, blue. But by repeating the word soothe here, and who will soothe the fisherman, the rhyme scheme is interrupted. We get this interruption that causes a bit of a problem for the poem. And it causes a problem because it is a problem. If it's the fisherman's job to soothe his children, who is there to soothe the fisherman? This is raising quite a serious question here. If we have certain expectations in society, i.e. fathers, men, it is their job to protect. What do they do when they feel unable to perform this role? And then we get this final line, which is a repetition of the opening lines. Who will soothe the fisherman who navigates the blue? What happens here is the poem has a sort of cyclical structure. We end where we began, with a fisherman who's navigating the blue. Ask yourself, what effects do you think this has? It's a very common technique that writers use to either bring our attention to the huge changes that have taken place, or perhaps that things have ultimately stayed the same. Now, what do you think's happened in this case? I would suggest that things have pretty much stayed the same for the fisherman, and that this use of repetition at the very end of the poem suggests that there is a sadness and trauma in his life that he's unable to escape. They follow him home. It's almost haunting him of how he can find some sort of soothing, how he can find release and tranquility amongst these troubles, this feeling of depression and worry. So the fisherman may be able to protect his children from fear of the dark or of imagined monsters, but who is there to protect him? And who will protect them from the much more serious problems that are out there in the world, like pollution or like the migrant crisis, which represents much more difficult and challenging issues that humanity has to face? The repetition here suggests that the trauma, the worry, is circular and unending for the fisherman. We get two stanzas and they're very different. And I think what this speaks to is a sort of duality which is central to the meaning of the poem. Think first of all about the fisherman himself. He lives a sort of double life. Externally, he could be seen as a happy man who goes about his life. He loves a jaunty tune. He has a family. No one would think he's suffering or that anything's going on under the surface. But actually, internally, he's navigating the blue and he's seeing things, perhaps they're real things, perhaps imagined things, that really are quite traumatizing and troubling to see. Again, human remains that are caught in his net when he goes to work. We also get this question of duality in terms of the father's role here. The father being seen as a protector, but then the question is who can protect him from the issues he faces? Again, whether they're grounded in reality or whether they're actually grounded in his own mental health and well-being. So Chingonyi is linking to broader discussions around male mental health, where men may feel pressured to appear strong and suppress their feelings and suffer in silence. And also notice here, there is a sort of metaphor that I'm using just naturally when we talk about feelings and when we talk about emotions and mental well-being. We talk about people appearing okay on the surface, but underneath they're actually going through difficulties. What's going on there when we so naturally talk about the surface and underneath? Well, we're using the metaphor almost of a sea itself, and that things may appear okay above, but under the surface there are issues. So perhaps the act of the fisherman himself dredging something up from underwater and the net receding, perhaps that could be seen as a metaphor for the fisherman confronting his own darkest fears and the things that are within him, perhaps within his subconscious, that he doesn't want to acknowledge. And this taps in also in terms of mental health and well-being. And if you're interested in sort of Freud or psychoanalysis, you could probably have a field day here with thinking about, well, what is the fisherman uncovering? What is receding here? Perhaps we're diving into the unconscious or the subconscious, and very often Freud's understanding of the human mind is depicted as an iceberg, because the idea of being under the surface of the water is very evocative of the things that we don't know that are part of who we are, or the things that we think about without consciously thinking about them. Something for you to perhaps research or think about if you're interested in that sort of stuff. We'll think about the poem as a whole in a moment. Let's think about this rhythm and this quality of the poem being a song. We're back to the beginning. We're back to the first stanza here. We're told that this poem is a song. It's the fisherman's song. And notice whether it's Chingonyi reading it or whether I'm reading it or when you're reading it, that this poem actually has a really obvious and consistent rhythm. Listen carefully. What sadness for a fisherman to navigate the blue. Again, as always, I'm emphasizing that, but you can really hear a rhythm there. What we have is 8 syllables on the first line, 6 syllables on the second line, and this alternates throughout the entire poem. What we're thinking about here is poetic meter. And because we're thinking about poetic meter, we actually think about the metric feet of poetic meter. Now, don't worry if you really don't understand all these words for talking about poetic meter. I'll link to a video that explains that. It can be really useful to know how to talk about poetic meter. I think it's more useful to be able to interpret it and think about what it means. But because we're thinking about poetic meter, we actually only count them in terms of the stressed syllables, the feet, okay? And here we have pairs of unstressed, represented by an X, and stressed syllables represented by a forward slash. What sadness for a fish, a man. And those 8 syllables become 4 iambs because it's written in iambic meter. We have 4 iambs in the first line and 3 in the second line, which is equivalent to iambic tetrameter and iambic trimeter. I believe that's pronounced. Perhaps I'm wrong. Fortunately, we don't have to use these big words because there's a name for exactly this pattern, which is common meter. And it's very common for poets to use this structure of 4 iambs followed by 3 iambs. And it creates a rhythm that we associate with old ballads and perhaps even other sorts of folk poetry. So you might have wondered why this poem has these indented lines. And I think this is a decision made by the poet to represent the rhythm. As there's 4 iambs on one line and 3 on the other, we naturally pause to let the rhythm sort of regulate itself. You could very easily perform this poem to a rhythm or a metronome. What sadness for a fisherman to navigate the blue and find among receding nets strange underwater blooms. Now, to accompany this common meter, Chingonyi also uses a consistent rhyme scheme, which is very common in ballads as well. Blue, blooms, view, soup. And this continues onto the next stanza as well. Here's another very famous poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Listen to this and listen to the rhythm. Swiftly, swiftly flew the ship, yet she sailed softly too. Sweetly, sweetly blew the breeze, on me alone it blew. So that is exactly the same rhythm as Fisherman's Song. And although this poem varies elsewhere, it's no coincidence that it resembles Chingonyi's poem, because Chingonyi has written it in a way that taps into these very old traditions of writing poetry. But not only that, it also engages with another tradition that is worth mentioning, the sea shanty or the sea song. Now, these are rhythmic songs that were sung by sailors, fishermen, and even pirates to accompany the hard work that came with manning a ship. Now, they can be funny or very rude and dirty, and they often contain a sort of tragic undercurrent.
In high winds, singing shanties was the only means of working in unison. These men had to climb up the rigging to fold away sails, but even high-risk tasks like these had a shanty.
Back to the second stanza here, we've got this consistent rhythm that goes throughout the poem. The poem's written in common meter. But what happens here on this line? We're expecting 6 syllables, but we get one more. Only Father's voice can soothe. What's going on here? Why, in a poem that sticks so strictly to common meter, does this line not conform? This is the issue at the heart of the poem. This is the problem here, that only Father's voice can soothe the children's fears, but the fisherman himself doesn't feel capable of doing that anymore. And what I think is really important when interpreting poetry is finding connections between what the poem is about and the way that it's written. Why is this line not conforming with the meter of the poem? And why did Chingonyi write it in this way to begin with? Have a think about it. Have a think about what ballads typically talk about and what sea shanties typically talk about. Is the fisherman in this poem similar to some of the figures of other sea shanties or ballads? And in what ways is he perhaps different? I mean, you could talk about what Chingonyi is trying to do by aligning it with the oral tradition of sea shanties or ballads. Or you could say that perhaps the rhythm and the repetition of it represents this unescapable and monotonous life the fisherman has, where he's unable to find soothing that he so desperately needs. And that is supported by the use of a consistent rhyme scheme that ooh sound that runs through the poem, and the way that the poem repeats and ends where it began. So, as I said at the beginning, quite a short poem, but lots to discuss there. So please leave a comment on what you think of the poem Fisherman's Song. And I think it's really important to think about form and structure and think about why Chingonyi has told this story of a deeply troubled fisherman in such an ambiguous and specific way. Thank you for watching. More Kyo Chingonyi poetry to come. Please leave a comment and I'd love to hear what you thought of the poem.